The gym was silent, except for the faint scrape of shoes against the floor. 5 men, all regarded as masters in their own right, had gathered with confidence, certain the afternoon would end as expected. In less than a minute, that certainty was gone. Each moved, calculated, precise, but it was clear from the first moment that Bruce Lee would not be challenged. By the time the dust settled, not a single opponent remained standing, yet no one had heard a yell, no fist had flown recklessly. What happened in those 37 seconds would become a quiet legend, witnessed and retold, a demonstration of control rather than fury, of inevitability rather than struggle. The gym smelled of worn leather and liniment, the faint tang of sweat lingering in the air from earlier sessions. Sunlight filtered through high windows, casting long, narrow beams across the faded mats. The room was unremarkable, ordinary to anyone passing by, yet to those present it held a quiet expectancy. Bruce Lee was there first. He moved among the equipment with a subtle rhythm, stretching, testing the weight of his body, adjusting his stance without haste. Each movement was deliberate, economical, like a painter tracing familiar lines before beginning a canvas. There was no display, no flourish. Nothing in the room suggested that the events to come would mark a lasting moment in martial history. Soon after, the black belts arrived. They entered as a unit, a silent procession of confidence. Each wore the unmistakable mark of skill. Posture upright, eyes sharp, shoulders squared. They carried themselves as men accustomed to being the best, men who'd been tested repeatedly in gyms, dojos, and informal challenges alike. They glanced at Bruce Lee once, a brief acknowledgement, a quick assessment, but their confidence remained intact. To them, he was another martial artist, a name perhaps whispered with admiration, but certainly a challenger they could measure and contain. Their steps echoed lightly across the floor, a subtle declaration of presence, of intent. Observers lingered near the edges of the gym. They described the air as taut, though unremarkable. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Every small sound, the shuffle of a shoe, the rattle of a water bottle, the distant hum of traffic outside, suddenly seemed amplified. Bruce Lee did not acknowledge them overtly. His eyes moved briefly, scanning the room, registering each arrival, each gesture. He did not shift his posture to impress, did not tense to intimidate. He simply existed within the space, aware, controlled, his focus inward yet fully present. The contrast between him and the challengers was subtle but profound. One side carried overt confidence, a reputation earned through routine and repetition. The other, a quiet authority that suggested skill beyond display, mastery beyond measurement. Neither spoke, yet the energy in the room shifted imperceptibly. By the time the black belts had positioned themselves, adjusting stances and exchanging whispered strategies, the stage was set. Nothing had yet happened, and yet, according to witnesses, it was already clear this was no ordinary encounter. Time stretched, measured not by minutes but by perception. Every person present felt the stillness, the gravity of unspoken expectations. The mats, the walls, the air itself seemed to hold a memory of what was about to unfold. And in that calm, observers knew, without seeing a single motion, that the outcome was inevitable. The gym was quiet. Not a tense quiet, not the quiet of fear or anticipation, but the quiet of an unbroken moment, a space awaiting the demonstration of mastery. And then, imperceptibly, the first shift occurred, the calm before the demonstration, a single breath away from the moment that would be remembered for decades. The challengers circled lightly, moving in the worn rectangle of the gym, their eyes tracing Bruce Lee's figure. Each step, each tilt of the head suggested evaluation, an assessment of balance, speed, and presence. They were masters in their own right, men who had spent years refining skill, yet in this moment, uncertainty crept into their confidence, though they did not speak it out loud. Bruce Lee remained still, not rigid, not tense, but composed, each micro-movement precise, a slight flex of the fingers, a measured shift of weight from one foot to the other. Nothing extravagant, nothing meant to provoke. Yet in those small, controlled gestures, observers sensed the presence of authority. It was quiet authority, the kind that did not announce itself with volume or gesture, but could not be ignored. The challengers attempted a polite acknowledgement, slight nods, curt bows, the traditional signs of respect mingled with challenge. Bruce Lee responded minimally, a brief inclination of the head, eyes steady, registering each individual without comment. It was a recognition, but not an engagement. The balance of the room shifted imperceptibly. Conversations that might have occurred between the challengers stopped. Small adjustments in stance, tiny gestures became a silent dialogue. Observers later described the energy as taut yet contained, a line drawn between what was expected and what might occur. The authority of Bruce Lee was evident not in action, but in restraint. Every movement, or deliberate lack thereof, communicated a mastery that the challengers could feel, even before the first motion of the eventual encounter. There was no posturing beyond what was necessary, no raised voices, no demonstration of strength. Instead, a quiet dominance filled the room. The challengers exchanged subtle glances, micro-expressions betraying the recognition that control had shifted without a single blow being struck. Witnesses later recalled a sense of inevitability settling over the group. The hierarchy was understood, even in silence. The psychological dimension was becoming evident. While the challengers prepared physically, Bruce Lee had already begun his demonstration mentally, mapping the room, the bodies, and the environment. The observers' recollections emphasize the oddness of the moment, a contest of skill unfolding before action, where victory was visible in posture, in attention, in minimal movement. For the black belts, this was unfamiliar territory. They were accustomed to asserting themselves through demonstration, through the visible mechanics of strength and technique. Here, however, the conventional signals were muted. Every conventional cue, the tightening of a fist, the lowering of a stance, the flash of eyes, was tempered, measured, deliberate. Bruce Lee's presence forced them to reconsider the meaning of dominance and the measures of control. By the time the room fell into stillness, the dynamic had shifted decisively. Observers recalled the subtle indicators, a slight hesitation before a step, a micro-adjustment in stance, a pause in breathing. These were men who had never felt uncertain in their competence, yet in Bruce Lee's measured presence, uncertainty had arrived. The authority of mastery, quiet and unspoken, was evident to everyone present. And in that quiet, the stage was fully prepared. No words were needed, no threats or displays were necessary. The challengers were aware, without seeing a single strike, that what was about to unfold would not follow the rules they expected. The room held its breath. The spectators were few but attentive, scattered along the edges of the gym, yet each one felt the shift in energy as soon as the black belts and Bruce Lee occupied the space. There were no overt gestures of excitement, no anticipatory whispers. Instead, a subtle stillness settled over the room, heavy but controlled, like the moment before a tide changes. Witnesses described noticing small details that would have gone unnoticed under ordinary circumstances. The faint scrape of a shoe on the mat, the soft exhalation of breath, a bead of sweat tracing a line down the side of a temple. Each sound, each motion felt magnified. The air seemed thicker, denser, charged not with noise, but with expectation. The challengers, too, began to feel it. Their confidence remained, yet it was now tempered by awareness. Subtle hesitation marked their steps. They paused just slightly before engaging in what should have been routine adjustments of stance or grip. Every glance toward Bruce Lee held a fraction more calculation than before, a silent acknowledgement that the situation had shifted. Observers later recalled that the tension was almost palpable in its quietness. Conversations dwindled entirely, and the room itself seemed to contract around the central triangle formed by Bruce Lee and the 5 black belts. The focus of the gym was no longer casual or peripheral. It was concentrated entirely on the potential moment that everyone sensed was imminent, though none could yet define it. There was no audible challenge, no exchange of provocation, yet the presence of a challenge was undeniable. The black belts, used to asserting themselves through action, had begun to measure themselves against something beyond strength or speed. Bruce Lee's control of the space, subtle as it was, dictated tempo and attention. Witnesses described a sense that the room's atmosphere had become a participant in the confrontation itself. Even minor gestures carried significance. A shifting of weight, a quickening of an inhale, the careful placement of a hand, each movement was scrutinized, interpreted, measured against an unseen standard. The gym, ordinary moments before, had transformed into an arena of expectation, though one that required patience, observation, and awareness rather than immediate reaction. The audience's attention sharpened further as Bruce Lee moved slightly, almost imperceptibly, adjusting stance, grounding his weight. Nothing dramatic, yet it was enough to signal that readiness was complete. Witnesses later noted a curious effect. The tension was not in anticipation of violence, but in anticipation of demonstration. The room seemed to collectively understand that skill, not aggression, would soon communicate what reputation alone could not. By the time the 37th second mark would arrive in the unfolding moment, the spectators and participants alike were aware of an unusual certainty. What was about to occur would be decisive, yet it would not be loud, it would not be chaotic. The inevitability was psychological first, kinetic second. And in that stillness, as the gym waited without realizing it, the lesson of the moment had already begun. Mastery is recognized before it is enacted, authority perceived before it is challenged. Then it began. Not with a shout, not with a lunge, but with a subtle shift of weight, a pivot of the foot, a glance that registered the smallest movement from each opponent. Bruce Lee moved within the space with quiet authority, each step measured, deliberate, and precise. The black belts paused mid-motion, as if time had conspired to freeze the room. Their eyes, once sharp and certain, now betrayed the faintest trace of doubt. Observers noted how the smallest gestures, an unsteady hand, a shifted weight, a glance away, signaled an internal recalibration. The authority Bruce Lee had projected was no longer theoretical, it had been enacted and observed, undeniable in its precision. No words were exchanged. There was no pleading, no exclamation, no challenge renewed. The collapse was silent, gradual, psychological rather than physical. Each man recognized the inevitability of what had just occurred. Their skill, while formidable, had been anticipated, read, and countered before it could be expressed fully. Witnesses later recalled the subtle signs of defeat. The challengers' stances loosened imperceptibly. Their posture, once commanding, bent slightly under the weight of recognition. Confusion and respect mingled on their faces, indistinguishable from the quiet awareness that they were in the presence of something beyond mere competence. The audience, too, felt the shift. What had begun as anticipation now settled into contemplative silence. No one moved to intervene. No one spoke to console or criticize. The demonstration had imparted its lessons simply, leaving only observation as a response. Bruce Lee remained still, composed, eyes tracking each subtle movement. His breathing was even, his posture unchanged. There was no exultation, no visible satisfaction, yet his presence communicated a singular clarity. Mastery was not proved by force, but by inevitability, by the quiet certainty of understanding and control. The psychological collapse extended beyond the challengers themselves. Observers noticed a subtle effect in the room's atmosphere. Tension had dissolved into a reflective stillness. Conversations restarted cautiously, punctuated by pauses to watch, to measure, to absorb the gravity of what had been demonstrated. No one spoke of winning or losing. The event had already reframed the very notion of competition. Witnesses later described the moment as transformative. The challengers, once confident in their dominance, now bore the weight of recognition, an awareness that skill could be anticipated, neutralized, and respected simultaneously. They were uninjured, yet disarmed, defeated, yet dignified. In those quiet seconds after the demonstration, the room itself seemed to acknowledge the shift. Authority had been asserted not with aggression, but with observation and controlled execution. Dominance had been achieved without confrontation, leaving all present to absorb the subtle yet profound lesson. By the end, no motion, no gesture, no spoken acknowledgement was needed. The psychological collapse had been complete, leaving a lasting imprint on those who had witnessed it, and an understanding that mastery could exist silently, efficiently, and irrevocably. The 5 black belts engaged instinctively, yet they were reacting to him, not initiating. Each movement they made was anticipated, contained, and redirected. There was no wasted motion, no theatrics. Observers later described it as a fluid choreography. Though it was not performance, it was applied skill distilled to its essence. A push here, a subtle off-balance there, and one opponent's footing faltered. Another's posture shifted, disrupted by a single controlled adjustment of Bruce Lee's weight. In a span of seconds, the challengers found themselves being readjusted as much psychologically as physically. Each action was minimal in force, yet decisive in effect. Witnesses recalled that no one made a sound, yet each movement communicated volumes. Bruce Lee did not strike to harm, he neutralized. The room's attention narrowed to the interaction of bodies and balance, to the quiet effectiveness of observation made action. There was inevitability in every movement, as if each opponent's next choice had already been anticipated and accounted for. Time, by perception, stretched. 37 seconds passed with a tension that felt longer, yet compressed in its significance. In that span, Bruce Lee had neutralized all 5 black belts, not through aggression, but through economy of motion, clarity of intent, and mastery over space. Observers remembered the uncanny precision. No fist or kick flew recklessly, no attack was overextended. The demonstration was almost surgical, each opponent disengaged from the encounter as smoothly as a dancer lifted from the floor. Every observer could see that control, not strength, defined the outcome. The psychological impact became visible mid-sequence. Hesitation, doubt, and recognition of mastery rippled across the challengers' faces. They were still conscious, still capable, yet the momentum had shifted irrevocably. They had been anticipated, read, and contained in ways that left no room for error, no opportunity for retaliation. The demonstration concluded as quietly as it began. The black belts were uninjured, yet their positions and composure had been fully neutralized. Bruce Lee, for his part, stood still, breathing evenly, posture unaltered, eyes calm. There was no flourish, no triumphant gesture, only the quiet, undeniable evidence of mastery. Witnesses would later describe the room as holding its breath long after the movement ceased. The demonstration had communicated more than any strike or word could. Authority had been asserted without aggression. Control had been exercised without noise. In the silence that followed, it became clear the demonstration was complete, the lesson quietly delivered. The black belts paused mid-motion as if time had conspired to freeze the room. Their eyes, once sharp and certain, now betrayed the faintest trace of doubt. Observers noted how the smallest gestures, an unsteady hand, a shifted weight, a glance away, signaled an internal recalibration. The authority Bruce Lee had projected was no longer theoretical, it had been enacted and observed, undeniable in its precision. Years later, those who had witnessed the demonstration recalled it with remarkable clarity. The gym, ordinary in every detail, retained an almost imperceptible resonance of that afternoon. Observers spoke not of speed or strength, but of presence, of composure, of the quiet certainty that had shaped every motion. The memory was vivid precisely because it had unfolded without fanfare, without noise. Bruce Lee's reputation, already notable among martial artists, shifted subtly but irrevocably. The demonstration was retold in hushed tones across dojos and gyms, not as a tale of victory, but as a lesson in observation, anticipation, and efficiency. The method of neutralization became secondary. What endured was the clarity of mastery. The 5 black belts themselves carried the experience forward in private reflection. They recounted the encounter not with resentment, but with a measured respect. Their skill remained intact, yet it was now framed against the standard of subtle authority, the quiet execution of knowledge, and the psychological command of space. Witnesses described how each man, in later years, referenced the encounter as a turning point, not for rivalry, but for understanding the deeper elements of martial discipline. Students who arrived at the gym years later could still feel the residue of that day. Instructors referenced it sparingly, emphasizing precision, control, and the economy of motion. Newcomers were often struck by the quiet lessons that seemed embedded in the space itself,
the maths, the walls, the ambient silence, all carrying the unspoken narrative of what had been witnessed decades earlier. Bruce Lee's influence extended beyond the immediate participants. The story became part of a larger conversation about skill as silent mastery rather than overt display. Film crews, authors, and martial historians cited the demonstration repeatedly, not for spectacle, but for what it revealed about efficiency, control, and psychological presence. It became a case study in mastery observed, a moment where reputation was validated not by noise or aggression, but by calm, decisive execution. The legacy was not ephemeral. The psychological imprint endured in those who trained in that gym, in those who studied Bruce Lee's methods, and in those who heard the story secondhand. It informed approaches to training, to confrontation, and to understanding the interplay between presence and perception. In every retelling, the emphasis remained the same. The lesson existed in action, in the quiet unfolding of skill, and in the recognition of inevitability. In retrospect, the demonstration was never about defeating opponents in a conventional sense. It was about redefining mastery, showing that control, observation, and anticipation could achieve what brute strength and aggression could not. Over time, the story became legend precisely because it required no embellishment. The facts themselves were extraordinary in their simplicity, clarity, and consequence. Years later, those present would reflect in silence, often without speaking of the details, simply acknowledging the weight of the moment. Bruce Lee had shown that authority need not be loud, that mastery need not be violent, and that a lesson delivered in calm, controlled execution could resonate far longer than any demonstration of aggression. And so, the gym continued its quiet existence, yet the memory of that afternoon persisted. The mats bore the echoes of measured steps, the air retained the sense of inevitability, and the story lived on in the recollections of witnesses, in the philosophy of those who trained thereafter, and in the legend of Bruce Lee, a legend built not on spectacle, but on quiet, irreversible mastery. No words were exchanged. There was no pleading, no exclamation, no challenge renewed. The collapse was silent, gradual, psychological rather than physical. Each man recognized the inevitability of what had just occurred. Their skill, while formidable, had been anticipated, read, and countered before it could be expressed fully. Witnesses later recalled the subtle signs of defeat. The challengers' stances loosened imperceptibly. Their posture, once commanding, bent slightly under the weight of recognition. Confusion and respect mingled on their faces, indistinguishable from the quiet awareness that they were in the presence of something beyond mere competence. The audience, too, felt the shift. What had begun as anticipation now settled into contemplative silence. No one moved to intervene, no one spoke to console or criticize. The demonstration had imparted its lessons simply, leaving only observation as a response.
Bruce Lee remained still, composed, eyes tracking each subtle movement. His breathing was even, his posture unchanged. There was no exultation, no visible satisfaction. Yet his presence communicated a singular clarity. Mastery was not proved by force, but by inevitability, by the quiet certainty of understanding and control. The psychological collapse extended beyond the challengers themselves. Observers noticed a subtle effect in the room's atmosphere. Tension had dissolved into a reflective stillness. Conversations restarted cautiously, punctuated by pauses to watch, to measure, to absorb the gravity of what had been demonstrated. No one spoke of winning or losing. The event had already reframed the very notion of competition. Witnesses later described the moment as transformative. The challengers, once confident in their dominance, now bore the weight of recognition, an awareness that skill could be anticipated, neutralized, and respected simultaneously. They were uninjured, yet disarmed, defeated, yet dignified. In those quiet seconds after the demonstration, the room itself seemed to acknowledge the shift. Authority had been asserted not with aggression, but with observation and controlled execution. Dominance had been achieved without confrontation, leaving all present to absorb the subtle yet profound lesson. By the end, no motion, no gesture, no spoken acknowledgement was needed. The psychological collapse had been complete.
leaving a lasting imprint on those who had witnessed it.